Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad you can attend Attitude's weekly ADHD Experts webinar. Most of us have been there, doing our best to make sure that our kids have the right environment to optimize their learning. Every school has its own set of challenges for kids with ADHD and learning disabilities. Is the curriculum accessible to your student? Is the school cooperative when it comes to evaluating your child? How difficult is it to get an IEP or 504 plan? Are teachers willing to go the extra mile in adapting lesson plans to your child's learning style? So many questions and so many different answers. Education and legal expert Susan Yellin will address the challenges your child faces in school. She'll give you strategies for deciding which actions to take to improve the learning environment in your child's current school. She'll also talk about things to consider if you've decided that a new school is the best course of action. Susan is the Director of Advocacy and Transition Services at the Yellin Center for Mind, Brain, and Education in New York. Every day she helps parents find solutions to school challenges for their kids. She is also the author of Life After High School, a guide for students with disabilities and their families. So with all that being said, let me turn it over to Susan Yellin. Thanks so much, Susan, for being here.
You're very welcome, and thank you, folks, for taking the time to listen to me. I hope I will cover those issues that are of concern to you. If I don't, we do have a question and answer session at the end. And as I went through my slides myself, I noticed that I go back and forth on a number of things because this isn't a straight line. So bear with me till we get to the end, and hopefully I'll cover those things that you're worried about. Look, it's always easier when our kids breeze through school. They start kindergarten, they go all the way through high school, they move along in their neighborhood programs, and everything is just fine. But unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. So let's start by understanding when you have a problem that may end up in you deciding that it's time to change schools. First of all, you need to recognize that all these problems that I'm going to be talking about happen with almost every child. The issue is how serious they are, how frequent they are, and to what extent does it turn your child's life upside down and therefore your life? Let's start with the first one. Are there changes in your child's school performance or school behavior? This doesn't involve just a note from the teacher. It involves persistent, consistent problems, suspensions, constant calls into school. I know of a young man who was excluded from lunch, from gym, from the bus. These were all messages to the family that things were not working out well. And if it's not simply a behavior problem in school, is there a behavior problem at home? Is it a child who's always been easygoing, suddenly very unhappy, behaving poorly? Is the school calling you in? Again, not simply a call or a note once in a while, or Johnny didn't do so great in reading today, but constant back and forth between the family and the school, to the point where when the phone rings, you just hit your forehead with your hand and you know that something else has gone wrong. Lack of academic progress is also something you need to focus on. Is your child moving ahead from year to year? Is he or she reading better each year, progressing in the math curriculum? Or somehow are things either standing still, or does there seem to be a regression when you look at other children, when you look at your other kids? Is the child that you're concerned about doing poorly academically? What about physical manifestations of stress? Again, every kid has a stomach ache or a sleepless night once in a while, or just doesn't want to go to school. But persistent, consistent, serious issues, kids who never had a twitch or a tic suddenly developing them, although that could be a medical issue, but we're talking behavioral things now. Is there something going on with your child that makes it clear that your kid is stressed? that there's something about going to school that is truly troubling to your child? And are there problems with your school or your district that aren't specific to your child? We'll talk about those more in a later slide, but we're going to label those systemic problems. Is there an issue with your district that doesn't really have to do with your child, but that really concerns you in terms of things like safety, class size, budget, resources? Again, we'll talk about those later, but that could also be a clue that there's something you need to look further at. Now, I'm going to divide, I hate dividing, but I'm going to divide the children about whom I'm speaking into two groups. And the first ones we'll talk about are those who don't have an IEP or a 504 plan. And the reason I'm talking about them is because sometimes when your kid manifests a problem, having an IEP or a 504 plan can be helpful. I always suggest starting your process by meeting with the teacher. And that holds even if you feel the teacher is part of the problem. At least this way you'll have had a chance to meet with the teacher, see for yourself what's concerning to your child, and get a sense of what's going on in the class. What does the teacher see or claim to see? Do you know that your child has ADHD or a learning disability or some other problem that would qualify him for an IEP or a 504 plan? I'm not going to get into the specific aspects of how does one qualify for those. That's 3 other webinars. But it's important to sense that your child may have a problem, for example, a reading issue, an attention difficulty, a medical problem, something that's interfering with school going well that might be the basis to obtain an IEP or a 504. And then, of course, the question becomes, are the problems you're seeing things that can be resolved by an IEP or a 504 plan? For example, either of those things can help with test taking. If your child is stressed around the whole subject of tests, possibly she or he would need extended time and a quiet location. Does your child have a medical problem and needs to have medication administered in school, or perhaps a special seat in the classroom, or breaks, or something else that would be able to be obtained through an IEP or 504 plan? And I'm lumping those together because this isn't really a look at how they are different and how they're the same and what each one does. I'm trying to give you a sense that some of the problems you're looking at may well be resolvable with one of these methods. If you feel your child simply needs academic support, again, an IEP could be great for that. Or if the curriculum is just too intensive for your child, an IEP, not a 504, permits revisions to the curriculum. For example, if your kid is doing fine in everything but is just struggling in French, an IEP may permit your child to not have to fulfill the foreign language requirement. There are issues with that later on when they're applying to college, but certainly in middle school, for example, that could be a big help for a kid who has difficulty with that. If your child has substantial behavior issues, lashing out, temper tantrums, a functional behavioral assessment, that's that FBA on the slide, resulting in a behavioral intervention plan, that's the BIP, which is part of the IEP process for kids with behavior problems, may be able to tease out what the behaviors are that are going on and put together a plan in the classroom, in the hallway, in the cafeteria to help resolve them. Might your child have such significant needs that he or she needs an individual one-on-one aid? That's something you can get with an IEP. Not always, not easily, but when it's needed. And maybe your child would need a specialized class or a specialized school. That's something also that can be obtained through an IEP. And we'll talk about that last item in more detail later because it's not so simple. Now, what if your child already has an IEP or a 504 plan? I'd still say meet with your child's teacher before you do anything else. And make sure that that teacher is aware of the IEP and 504 and is following what that plan says. If you find after meeting with your child's teacher that the issues that your child is facing are not resolved, it's time to convene a meeting of your IEP or 504 team. And the questions you need to think about at that meeting is the school unable or unwilling to address your child's problems? Let me give you an example of each. Unable to address your child's problems. Your child has both significant attention issues and is academically gifted. He's struggling socially because he doesn't seem to fit in anywhere. Does your school not have a gifted program? Or do they have the program and are unable or unwilling, rather, to put your child in it because he may have a 504 or an IEP? Well, I'm sorry, they would say. He's got these other things going on. We really don't think he fits in that program. Another example would be if your child has dyslexia. That's a very specific reading problem. Is your school unable to give the right kind of reading instruction for your child because they just don't have anybody and can't find anybody with those qualifications? Or are they unwilling to even try to bring aboard someone who can do a Orton Gillingham or Linda Mood Bell or Wilson program for a dyslexic child? Those are the ones that are scientifically proven to be helpful. Some of these go back to this question, is there a systemic issue with your school or your district? Do they not have the things that you need in order for your child to be successful? So let's look at what kinds of things are systemic. First of all, safety. And that's a key one nowadays in particular. Is the school located in a neighborhood that's very problematic? Are there guards at the door? Are there security issues? Has there been problems in the past that haven't been resolved? What about class size? There are lovely suburban schools where there are 15 and 17 children in each second grade class. And then there's the city of New York, which can have 20-something, close up to 30 in past years. I don't know if it's still that large. And that makes a big difference. And part of that class size is how many teachers can they put in each class. How does your school respond to bullying? Is there an active anti-bullying program? Is bullying an issue for your child? What about the resources that your school may have? Do they have specialized instruction of the proper kind that kids would need? What about a gifted program or a class that would include both, they call them co-taught classes, that would include both typical learners and students with learning issues, all in one class with a regular instructor and a special ed teacher? Those are very helpful to a lot of kids, both the typical learners and those who have learning needs, special learning needs. Some districts have them, some districts don't. Is the administration responsive? When there is a problem, can you get in to see the principal? Can you get in to see the superintendent, the head of guidance? Or is the attitude of the school and the school district, we know best, you're the parent, leave the school system to us? You see that less and less, but it still exists in some places. What I'm trying to get at is that if there are systemic problems, there's really not that much you can do. Well, you could run for the school board, you can do all sorts of things like that long term, but short term, in order to resolve your child's issues, you may have to seriously consider changing schools and or school districts. It may not be something that can be resolvable. Now, of course, there are other more typical reasons for changing. Your child's moving up to a higher grade from elementary to middle school or middle school to high school. Your family's making a move. You're moving your home for one reason or another, or one husband, wife are moving jobs. One of your other children may need to be in a different school for whatever reason. And you want to, especially for young kids, you want to keep them together. Pick up and drop off at too many different schools can be more than many families can manage. And what if your school is far away? The way that certain municipalities, certainly cities, work is a child may or may not be permitted to go to their closest school. There's things like lotteries and preferences. And you may find that there could be a first school with a lovely first grade down the street, but your child is going 2 subway stops away. That can be a problem. So that could be another thing that could motivate a family to want to change. The next slide could be the topic of several different webinars, so bear with me, please. Let's look broadly at the kinds of schools that you could consider if you're going to be making a change. First, there's regular public schools. By that, I mean a school that you have the right to go to for free in your locality. There's also charter schools, which we'll look at more later, but those are another kind of public school. Then there are different types of private schools. There's private schools for typical learners, and those could range from your average student to your very advanced student. Some do accommodate special learning needs or attention difficulties, but it's not their primary mission. Or there are private special education schools, and there are enormous variety of these. We'll talk later about approved versus unapproved schools, but some of these are specifically for kids with one or another disability. You'll find schools for children with autism. You'll find schools for children whose learning problems are language-based, schools that are broader. There are some schools that I would recommend, for example, to a child who can sit still and work nicely. There are other special education schools that would accommodate a child who's out of his seat constantly and has real attention difficulties. And then there are parochial schools, religious schools of all stripes that most communities have at least one, sometimes more than one. Within the world of public schools, there are magnet schools, schools that will be drawing children from all throughout a district. Perhaps they specialize in STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and math, schools for the arts, schools for technology, vocational schools. These schools have a special mission. If, depending upon where you live, your district may have 2 or 3 or 4 elementary schools, and possibly more than 1 middle school and high school. So even if you stay within your district and you stay within your public school, there's a possibility for change. Most public districts won't make a change absent a special circumstance, but sometimes that special circumstance can be presented to them and they will be accommodating. Again, we're going back to our question of whether or not your issues are systemic. If you've got district-wide issues such as huge class sizes, budget problems, safety issues, moving from one public school to another may not resolve your problems. Charter schools, you need to remember, are public schools. They're generally operated under a contract with a private company, and they're required to accept all students regardless of disabilities, but there have been, certainly anecdotally, and it's been reported enough so that let's assume that it could be an issue, that some charter schools are not as equipped or not as willing to accept children who have special learning needs. Now, charter schools can have a very specific mission or educational approach. Some of them require uniforms where the public school may not. Some of them have a very firm approach to education. You sit quietly, you raise your hand, and that's great for some kids who need that kind of discipline. It's not great for kids who don't function well that way. So the world of charter schools is very broad. They differ greatly, and you really need to do an investigation, and we'll talk about that in a minute, before you decide that a charter school is a good choice for your child. But it could be. Private schools, and these are not special ed private schools. These are private schools for parents who don't want to participate in the public system for whatever reason, and who decide that they want a private education for their child. The school makes the admissions decisions. If you take a look at the requirements for admissions, it's a little bit like looking at a college website. They generally have smaller classes, more individualized instruction. Some will work nicely with kids with mild learning disabilities and attention issues. Generally, they don't work well and won't accept a child whose issues in those areas are significant. The world of private schools is very variable. Some areas have a great many of them, some not so many. And they're expensive. At least they can be quite expensive. And there's no tuition reimbursement available from the public district, which is not the same as private special education schools. We'll talk about that in a minute. But a private school, especially if you want to have a smaller class, intensive instruction, specialized interests, fostered sports, music, they can be terrific, but they're expensive. And then there's the world of private special education schools. There are far fewer of them than there are regular private schools, and they may not be available where you reside. You do get busing, by the way, if your child has an IEP, within, let's say, 50 miles, for example, in most situations. But you don't want your child on a bus for 50 miles. They generally tend, as I said before, they tend to specify in terms of who they will handle best. So some will generally limit themselves to students who have a language-based learning disability. They have difficulty reading. Some will deal with children on the autism spectrum. Some will be very comfortable with extensive issues with attention. Some will not. They are very different in their missions. They all tend to have small classes, dedicated teachers. All teachers are dedicated, but teachers who are dedicated to the mission of working with kids with special needs. And they are expensive. But unlike private non-special education schools, those that are for students with IEPs may be eligible for tuition reimbursement. We'll talk about that in a second. And then there are parochial schools, and those may align very well with your family's values. You cannot generally get a 504 plan in a parochial school because in order for a school to offer 504 plans, they need to be taking federal funds. Some schools will have federal funds through their lunch program or an after-school program, but you need to do a little detective work. Most general rule parochial schools don't have 504 plans. There are exceptions, and the issue is whether or not they take federal funds. So how do you decide if a school is a good fit for your child? I go to the websites first. If I have been to a school and visited a school and toured a school, they vary in quality, but they do give information on what do they consider their mission. Where are they? I do a lot of Google Map searches. How far are they from the house of the student I'm talking about? What kind of special programs do they have? What's their tuition? What is their admissions deadline? When are their open houses? And an open house is fine, but it's not really enough to get a feel for a school. I recommend to parents that when they can, they visit when classes are in session. That if they have, for example, a child who will be a fourth grader if and when they enroll in that school, I tell them to check out this year's third grade. That's the grade that their child is in now. And those students will be their child's peers. They will move up to fourth grade. Your child will be coming in fourth grade. What are those kids like? Does it feel like your child will fit with them? Then I also recommend that they visit the fourth grade class. Generally, they can get a sense of who the teacher might be, what kind of work is going on. Look at the bulletin boards, look around the classroom, see if you can even keep your ears open for a lesson. What is fourth grade like in that school? Because that's the year your child will be beginning. And most parents, and I've been through this process myself, you can have a sense of whether your child will fit well in that setting. Let's talk money. financial considerations are a major issue. They are not a problem for any public school, and your public school may determine that they cannot serve your child and can place your child in what's called an approved non-public school. Each state has a list of schools that they call approved schools. That does not mean that an approved school is better than an unapproved school. It's a way of weighing the curriculum, the calendar, the requirements. Does this school fit in with what that state feels a public school should have? Do they take, and here in New York where I live, they take Regents exams. Does that school give Regents exams? And other states have other exams called by different names at the end of each class. So if your public school can't serve your child properly, you do have the option to be enrolled by your district in a non-public school. But let's take a step back. Whether your child goes to public or a private school, and that goes for specialized private schools or general private schools, his or her IEP services travel with them. The IEP is given to the student. The difference is that a student in a public school gets their IEP services under one funding stream, and the students who are in a non-public school get it through a different funding stream. This section of the law is different. So there's more services in a public school under the IEP than there would be in a private school. As I said before, 504 wouldn't necessarily apply to a private school. And the issue of tuition reimbursement, which is complicated, simply requires as a starting point that the public district doesn't give you a free, appropriate public education, universally referred to as FAPE. That's the first step in a lengthy reimbursement process, and success isn't guaranteed. And then, of course, all private schools have scholarships. Some have substantial scholarships, some not so much. So these are all financial considerations. You should know that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the federal law, actually includes provisions about what happens when a student already has an IEP and is changing schools. For example, you move. And it's very straightforward. If you're moving from one school to another within the district, and that would include moving from elementary to middle, from middle to high school, there is no change. Your IEP stays the same, just as it does when you move from third grade to fourth grade. Within your state, a move to another district within your state, your child is entitled to comparable services. The new district in your state can adopt the old IEP, or they can set up a new one, but no new evaluation is required. So they will continue to do what was done in your prior district. They probably hold an IEP meeting, no new evaluation, and they may or may not set up a new IEP. If you're moving to a new state, there will be a new evaluation. Until that can be completed, your child's entitled to comparable services. The IDEA also requires, and so does FERPA, the Federal Education Records and Privacy Act, requires your old district to promptly provide records to your new district. Section 504 has no such carryover provisions, but it does apply in all states, so you could begin the process again. So, how can you help your child? First, of course, the easiest thing is to make changes at natural breakpoints. You're moving from middle school to high school, that's a good time to make a change. But that's not very practical for many families for many reasons. Don't surprise your child. He or she, assuming they're of age to have even a simple conversation, should be part of the process. Don't spring this on them. That's not going to be helpful. And make sure that your new school has all relevant records. Things like report cards, IEPs, 504 plans, evaluations. Trying to present a fresh face to a district, it sounds great, but they really need to know who they are dealing with in order to be able to serve your child, help your child, support your child. if you are like most parents, and I know when I was at this stage, I was like most parents, I had, and I probably still have, boxes of records. You should be able, if your old district isn't helpful or isn't prompt, to provide your new school with copies of the things they would need to get started. Do a lot of preparation. Visit the area, visit the school, try to make connections with new classmates. Your real estate broker may even be able to help you with that. Meet teachers. If your child has special needs, you might want to investigate whether the district has a special education PTA. Some do. These are all things that can help you get your child ready for the new program, the new school. And that's what I've got. And I'm ready for any questions you may have.
Well, that was great, Susan. Thank you. Very enlightening. There's sort of some housekeeping questions. One person wants to know, is there a list of schools for ADHD kids? We have a directory on attitudemag.com, but are there other lists so people can just pick and choose from there?
That's a good question. There is a listing under the Association of Independent Schools. There's a school search feature there. And one of the things you could look for is learning issues. I'm not sure that it specifically focuses on attention. You know, Great Schools will discuss, the greatschools.org will discuss a school, but not really have, as far as I know, have a list. I have my own list that I've developed over the years for I'm located in New York, so for my region of the country. But, you know, if you are talking to other parents, you'll get suggestions. I would do a Google search online and put in the name of a town and special education schools. All kinds of ways to do it, but no specific list that I know of. There are those for colleges, by the way, but not for elementary and high schools.
I see.
Although there may be, and I just don't know them.
One person wrote in, I just wanted to see if this was widespread. He says many schools here in Connecticut will allow students to shadow, I guess, a school for a day and attend classes to see what it's like. Have you heard of anything like that? Or
I haven't heard of a specific program, but first of all, that's fantastic. And secondly, schools do it informally, especially private schools. If you're looking to put your child in a particular school, they'll have them visit for a day or even more than that. So, but what a wonderful program to have in practice.
Several parents have written in about their 2E son or daughter, and that the schools don't seem to understand the concept of 2E, never mind try to address an exceptional student's strengths. Do you want to talk about 2E a little?
Didn't we just do a question and answer in Attitude Magazine about 2E? I think we did, and if they would go back and search it, that would be great. There is a search feature for the Attitude Ask the Experts column, and it should be in there. But just basically, the fact that the child has academic strengths as well as challenges, the U.S. Department of Education has a letter out explaining this to parents. And basically what it says is that the fact that a child has academic strengths does not remove the obligation of the school to serve their academic or behavioral deficits. The school is wrong, in other words, if it doesn't provide for that. And I do think there's something in Attitude itself that has a discussion of this.
Okay. One parent asks, my 15-year-old wants to leave public school and go to school online. Is that a viable option?
Well, here's the thing. Can they get their coursework done? Probably. But I think that the question is why? Does the student have... What's going on? Most teenagers love school. They may not like the work, but they love to be with their peers. So why is this child, this teenager, not comfortable going to school? And I think that's the question the parent needs to inquire about. Is there bullying going on? Is there a social problem in school? Are they riding the bus for 2 hours to get there? Is there something, does the school not offer a particular area of study that the student wants to engage in? And that could be something, maybe instead they could go to a local college or a local community college for part of the day. But my own response to that is, what else is going on? What's wrong where a teenager who would normally want to participate in school doesn't wish to do so? So some parent has to be a bit of a detective. That's not enough information.
A mom asks, when visiting schools, what are some questions you should ask the potential teacher to see if they are appropriate to handle your child with ADHD?
Well, I think one question would be to come up with sort of a one-sentence description. So let's assume that your child with ADHD has difficulty staying in their seat. So you might say to the teacher, how do you handle a child who's unable to sit still for the length of a lesson? And schools have all sorts of ways of handling that. Some of them put bouncy bands under the seat. Some of them have the child walk around the perimeter of the classroom. Some of them have rolly rods under the seat. There's all kinds of gadgets and devices. Some will make that child the class messenger and send them out of the classroom a couple times in the morning and a couple times in the afternoon for some supposed errand. So there are all sorts of ways. Ask the teacher specifically. Don't even necessarily say, my child has this problem, but I would say, how do you handle this situation? You may not have that much of a chance to talk directly to the teacher. It's great if you can. It may be more of a question for the administration. How do your teachers handle this? And if you are visiting the classroom, you'll see how they handle it. I remember visiting one school that was really strong in kids who have reading and language issues. And there was one little boy who just could not sit still. He had ants in his pants, no question about it. And he was young. And I could tell already from that school and the way that he was handled in the classroom, and there happened to have been an administrator taking us around, I could see that was not going to be a school I would recommend for kids who couldn't sit still, because that just wasn't their thing.
Right. Several questions about being bullied and teased. This one is very specific. If your child is being bullied, teased, especially for being different, can he be moved to a private school, or would he have to be moved to another public school in the area? And the question is, I guess, from the parent is, the other public school, the kids in there, their special needs are far greater than the child who's being teased.
Well, if a child's being bullied because they're different, that would be a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, possibly Section 504. I'm assuming that the child does not have an IEP. In some districts, there are specific guidelines when a child is bullied, and they have to call them safety transfers, and they will move that child. So I would start very quickly. I'd start with the teacher, determine whether or not she sees what's going on. I'd move up to the administration in the building. And again, this is a child without an IEP. What are they doing about it? How are they fixing it? I would then move up to the district level, which, as the parent has noted, that's not a really good solution. And I might speak to a local attorney about the option of putting their child in a private school and seeking reimbursement from the district for their failure to deal with the bullying situation. Now, that's not something that's well settled in terms of law, but it seems to me that putting a child in private school if they're being bullied because they're different, if they have a disability, that's one thing. Then you really are talking about 504 and the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. If they're being bullied for social reasons that don't have to do with that, that's a different problem. The only direct right to reimbursement that I am aware of and that I've dealt with is kids who are not getting a free, appropriate public education and who have IEPs. But And, the U.S. Department of Education has sort of taken a step back from some of their enforcement issues, unfortunately, at this point. So, but I would definitely look into it, speak to an attorney in their jurisdiction to see what the rights might be.
Mm-hmm. What about Montessori schools? Several parents have asked about those.
It's a very different approach to education. Works fine for some kids, not so great for other kids. It's not a real solution for a child who's struggling with reading or attention. I am not an expert on the Montessori philosophy. I would definitely look into it, but I would be cautious that innovation is not always a solution to these fairly traditional problems. So it's really, if that appeals to you, that's fine. I don't know enough, and I certainly don't know enough about each child to decide whether or not that's a solution.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I will throw out there homeschooling. A lot of parents have brought that up. What would be some of the challenges there? Or I know it's not an easy transition.
Well, the challenges to homeschooling, first of all, you need to be part of an approved program. You can't simply bring your child home and declare that he or she is being homeschooled. You need to sign on with an agency or a consortium that provides curriculum and meets the guidelines that your state requires. Some of the homeschooling consortiums are very rich in terms of the interaction among the students. They have programs, they have sports, they have social events, so that it happens that they are doing much of their classroom work at home, but they are also dealing with other children in a very good way. However, the problem is that for a kid who has attention or learning challenges, it's not that easy to teach them all day long. Most parents may find that when the child, look, as I'm speaking now as a parent, when my kid left for school, I sat down in the chair and let my breath out. And I'm not sure I could have I'm highly educated and all that. I couldn't have managed having my child at home all the time. Now, I'm sure there are parents far better than I am with far better temperaments who want to do it for a variety of reasons. But I'm not sure that, first of all, you want to have specialized training in how to deal with some of the behavioral issues. Secondly, you're missing the social piece. And again, there are homeschool programs that get around that. But simply pulling your child out of school and homeschooling them may not always be as great a solution as it first seems. It's something to think about. Where are you going to be down the road in a year or two? It's certainly a possibility, and I know people who do it and do it successfully, but it's not always the best solution. It just may seem to be the easiest, but it's not always.
Yes. More specific questions. Each student is individual, so each one has his or her own challenges. My son is a 9th grader at a college prep public school. He decided to take a break from his ADHD medication, and his grades have suffered. He now has a 504 plan. If his grades don't improve, the policy is that he would be asked to leave the school. Do we have any rights that would help him stay at that school? He wants to stay there. Now, I don't know if it's private school, what it is exactly.
Well, it makes a difference, and let me tell you why. A private school, first of all, a public school cannot require a student to take medication. A private school can simply say if he can't behave, he can't stay. Very simple. And that's the problems with private schools. It's a public school has to take you. Sometimes we'll encounter children who are so complex that we'll turn to the parents and say, you really just want to keep him in public school because they will have to deal with this, depending, on the things that a local school can do. But if he's in a private school, then they can dismiss him, not for not taking his medication, but for not behaving or not attending or not keeping up his grades. If he's in a public school, it's a little bit more complicated because they are basically saying you need to be medicated in order to stay here. Arguments can be made in both directions. If they're saying that the child has to leave the school because he can't behave or keep his grades up, that's one thing. If it's just a shorthand for saying you better take your meds. And then the other question is, if the child really needs the meds in order to perform, what's wrong with the meds? Maybe he needs to go back to his physician and see why he's not comfortable with the meds. Why isn't he tolerating them? There are lots of attention meds out there. They have all different side effects and all different positive effects. And if a child can't handle one, they might be able to handle another. And it's clearly making a difference in his performance, so it's not, an irrelevant thing. I would start by going back to the doctor or having the physician talk to the child, maybe with or without the parent, and find out what's going on. Why don't you like the meds? Why aren't they working for you?
Yeah, that's a good point. This parent says she recently moved from a city to a smaller town. Our new school has been relatively accommodating of my son's IEP needs, but she finds that when it comes to behavior concerns of her child, they don't seem to comprehend that he's not neurotypical. So I guess, how do I help advocate for him and help?
I would go back to the IEP team and ask them to do a functional behavioral assessment, FBA. Explain that you believe that his emotional and behavioral needs are not being adequately met. It's a different kind of assessment than you would do academically, and it's not routinely done for every IEP, but it's a right under the IDEA. Ask them to do a functional behavioral assessment. Let's see where his behaviors impact his life, how he's behaving. The thing that comes out of that process should be a behavioral intervention plan. And there should be a plan in place, just like an IEP, but it's a behavioral plan. And it should deal with what's going to happen if he does this, what's going to happen if this occurs. And it should be helpful that he has the right to get this. And if they balk, I would take a look at the statute. It's online, and show it to them and say to them, look, he's got the right to have his behavior examined and for you, school, to come up with a plan. She should also be mindful of the fact that students, and we're now way off of the reservation in terms of what we started talking about, students who have or should have an IEP have very special rules about suspension. So if there's disciplinary proceedings being brought against him, that's something else to be mindful of. And I think we've we've also written about that over the years.
Yes.
So there's a special hearing that needs to be held when a child who has or should have an IEP behaves in a way that could get them suspended.
One parent asked, can you change schools too often?
Yes.
We left our charter school after third grade and went to a public school where he was bullied. We therefore switched to parochial that touts itself as being inclusive, but wasn't. We want to leave again in search of a better fit. Is this too much moving, even if the school isn't great? Is the moving worse than the school?
It depends. It depends on how bad the school is, how bad the school situation is. How often is too often? It wasn't made clear in the question. Are they moving the child 2 or 3 times within the course of a year, or is the child moving every 2 or 3 years?
Yeah.
If you're staying in the same neighborhood and your child can have the same friends, that might help mitigate the problem. If you're moving your child to a place where he will be cut off from his friends, that's another aspect of things. So, but, it depends. Some kids do change pretty well, and then if they're in a great setting, that's fine. Some kids, it's the change itself that's so hard for them. So it really does depend on the individual child and the circumstances. But I would be reluctant to change just for changing at this point. Maybe you can wait until a natural break, middle school, high school. Those are the times when children mix it up, and it wouldn't be as distressing or disturbing to change schools because everybody's changing.
This is sort of a very technical question. What happens if my kid goes to private school in one school district, but we live in another? To which district do we send our IEP FBA request? The one we live in, or the one my kid's school is?
There's actually rules about that. There's rules about that. Let me see if I can give you the rule in a way that's not even more confusing than the confusing rule. The rule is there are two districts that are relevant. One is the district of residence. That's the district where the child's family resides. The other is the district of location. That's where the child's present school is located. When you're dealing, the IEP and all that stuff is made up by the district of location. So if a child from the suburbs is going to school in the city, it's the city district that will make up the IEP. They get partial reimbursement from the suburban district in which the family resides, but the district of location of the school is where things happen. Does that answer the question?
I think so. I understood it.
Okay.
Yeah, that was clarifying. And I think this one might be the last question. What can you do if a public school refuses to do special ed evaluation gifted testing, despite providing them with a psychological evaluation with diagnoses, ADHD, ODD, and post-traumatic stress disorder, and a written request per, I told you this was technical, per IDEA, but keeps contacting you over the phone to calm down or come pick them up because the child is not listening and following directions. So it sounds like basically they're just saying calm down, but we're not going to do the evaluation, despite it seems like this person following all the rules.
All right. So what I would do is I would commence a hearing to compel the district to evaluate your child. I would find a local special education attorney, and I would have them assist you in, you're going to commence a proceeding. It's not a lawsuit exactly. It's a hearing. It's an administrative hearing, compelling the district to evaluate your child. Now, the private evaluation that you've submitted to them, they are required by law to consider it, but not necessarily to follow it. So you want them to conduct an evaluation. Then once they've conducted the evaluation, if you disagree with it, now this is with the public evaluation, then you have a right for them to pay for a private evaluation. But if they haven't done a public evaluation, that right doesn't yet exist. Not to be confusing, but it's a confusing subject. Part of the evaluation should be a functional behavioral assessment, because clearly if they're being called to pick the child up, there's something behavioral going on.
Yes, right. Yeah, I think next time maybe we should just do a webinar on these behavioral assessments, because I know they're just such a big part and people don't know much about them. Thanks for being here, Susan. That was fantastic. Really, you had to pick through a lot of very technical questions, but I got the answers. It came through loud and clear for me. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you for having me, and I hope that this was helpful to parents. It's not easy parenting, and we all need all the help we can get.
Yep. Thank you again, Susan, and have a great day.
For more Attitude Podcast and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.